Good evening, everyone. Welcome to India FOSS Week 2021. We are going to discuss how free and open source software in India can bring much more growth opportunities in some of socio-economic development. And we are also going to launch our report on the topic, the state of free and open source software in India, shortly in a while. We also have a power-packed panel discussion on FOSS and governments today, and we have representatives across the governments joining us to talk and discuss how free and open source software can advance GovTech infrastructure in India. I would just do a quick agenda for today, some basic housekeeping announcements. So we are hosting this event on Classmeet, which is an open source video conferencing tool by Chigaru Tech. And you are hearing all of this via YouTube stream. You are free to comment over the YouTube stream on with your questions, share your feedback there, and our moderators would pick those from there and share it with the panelists and moderators here in the Classmeet window. We have opening remarks today by Venkatesh Hariharan, also known as Venki, from Open Invention Network. Then it followed by key findings from the State of FOSS India report by me, Gaurav Godhwani, from CivicDataLab. And lastly, we have a panel discussion on FOSS and governments by Varad Pande from Omidyar Network India, followed by a Q&A session. With this, I would hand it over to Venki to give opening remarks. Venki has also graciously agreed to write preface of our report and have been supporting our team for a while. Over to you, Venki.
Thanks, Gaurav. Thanks for inviting me to give the opening remarks for the FOSS week. Like Gaurav said, my name is Venkatesh Hariharan, known in the industry as Venki. I've been involved with the open source community since 1999 when Prakash Advani and I started a non-profit called IndLinux, indlinux.org, to localize Linux to Indian languages. Since then, I work with Red Hat, and I'm currently the India representative for the Open Invention Network, which is basically an organization that was formed to protect the open source community from patent litigation. So I've seen the open source community evolve and been involved in open source initiatives and open source public policy initiatives for the last 2 decades. And in the last 2 decades, this is the first time that I have seen somebody come up with a report which takes a very comprehensive look at the FOSS ecosystem, industry, academia, government, and the community. There have been academic papers on the FOSS community in India. There have been books which also, refer to the FOSS community in India. Chris Kelty's 2 Bits, research by people like Jasmine Falls, etc. But there has not been a comprehensive report like this. So I'm very, very happy that this kind of a report has come out. It took almost 6 months and a team of 10 people who did extensive revisions to the report. So I'd like to thank CivicDataLabs for doing the study, and I would like to thank Omidyar Network India for supporting the study. This kind of research, this kind of history is really important because I think we in India do not do enough to record the technology and business history of our own country. I'd like to see more such initiatives. I'd like to see. I hope that this is just the beginning. This is not the last word on the subject of FOSS in India, but there is more writing on this topic in India. This study also comes at a very interesting time in the history of FOSS in India. 2 decades ago, when we went to the CTOs and large enterprises and spoke about FOSS, we were met with a lot of skepticism. The idea that a loose coalition of people who are scattered over the internet will be able to, create world-class software like operating systems and web browsers and web servers, etc., was fairly unthinkable. I remember that it took us about 2 months to, one get a meeting with the CTO of a large public sector enterprise, and he asked us what is free and open source software. And when we told him that it's built by this community of people across the internet, he just laughed us off and said, you know, this will not work. And I think the other question he had was, and this we kept hearing from many people, is if it is free software, why do you charge for it? And we had to spend many hours explaining that we are charging for services, not for the basic software itself. Uh, but while businesses were skeptical, there was this uh, enthusiastic band of people who are taking the source code, downloading it. At that time, we had these Linux user groups and the GNU Linux user groups in cities across India, and we would download it on floppy disks or later on in CDs and exchange at these groups, and that's how this whole community built up. And what really sparked the enthusiasm of this community was the fact that you can download the software, modify it, change it, tweak it to your heart's content, and you did not have to take anybody's permission. And then gradually, some of us thought that if we have to bridge the digital divide in India, we saw that we were able to use computers in English with great fluency, but somebody who knows Hindi, Marathi, Gujarati, etc., for them using computers is very hard. And even foundational infrastructure like fonts, etc., were not available. So a bunch of enthusiasts came together, linguistic communities across India, Oriya language, Bengali language, and other Malayalam and other linguistic communities came together to start localizing the KDE and the genome user interface of Linux to Indian languages. Today, Linux is available in about 17 Indian languages. So when you install Linux on your computer, you can, at the opening screen, set one of the 17 Indian languages, thanks to the work of the FOSS community in India. Many proprietary software also, when they enable Indian languages, they are using Indian language fonts created by the localization community. So that was the power of open source. The fact that all of us could come together, collaborate, share our ideas. Gradually, over the course of a decade, businesses also started to use FOSS. Uh, Initially, they were tentative. They would use it on non-critical systems, email servers, etc. But as the ruggedness and the reliability of Linux and Apache and other open source software grew and became in many cases better than proprietary software, uh, Linux, open source, FOSS started moving from the edge of the enterprise to the heart of the enterprise. Today, many mission critical applications, including stock exchanges, where if the system is down by even 1 minute, the losses run into crores and crores of rupees, or e-commerce platforms, or insurance companies, etc., uh, run on the back of Linux, open source, Apache, and many other FOSS software. It's also it's also good thing to see that the Indian government has been a leading adopter of FOSS in India. In fact, some of the largest e-government systems are built on the back of FOSS. GST, for example. And in the initial days when I spoke to the folks at GST, they said that this is a large government project. If we have to put in another $100 million, that's not a problem. So money is not the problem, but the fundamental thing that we want to ensure is that we have full control of the technology, and if we want to take out one component and swap it with another, we should be able to do that. And that's the reason that we chose FOSS for building GST. So I think we are at a very interesting stage where the adoption of FOSS has been tremendous. but there is much more to be done. I think one of the stark things that we saw in the study is that industry, academia, government, and the community are all working in their own silos. And I think in this study, we kind of also looked at what can be done to address that. So I'm not going to steal Gaurav's thunder and share that right now, but I think Gaurav can walk you through that in his presentation. But I want to just conclude by saying that we have done a tremendous amount of work in terms of bringing FOSS to this level, but we are just at the Everest base camp. There is much more to be scaled, and if India uses this at a very strategic level, we can scale greater heights. And I look forward to working with all of you in that particular journey. Thank you so much, and over to you, Gaurav.
Thanks, Vanki. Let me just restart my. Thanks a lot, Venki, for giving a wonderful introductory remarks to this session. Uh, Heading back to our presentation. So, uh, just to explain what do we mean by free and open source software, how are we defining free and open software as part of this report and presentation? So, free and open source software is something which is freely licensed to use, copy, study, change, improve, and redistribute. And all of this is possible because authors of that software have published their knowledge, their understanding of the piece of software and code in open domain by giving a legal open license to it for you to use, study, and do all these different features. And FOSS is also an inclusive term. It covers both free software and open source software. The free software movement is more about defining what are the freedoms available for users of the software, while open source software takes a business-centric approach on how distributed network of people can come together and collaborate. Both of them have different cultures, philosophies, but have almost similar ownership model. That's where, for this study as well as today's presentation, we would use the term FOSS, covering both free software and open source software. More than 85% of India's internet is now powered by FOSS. When we book a train ticket via IRCTC, or when we avail life insurance via LIC, or do stock exchange on Bombay Stock Exchange Limited, uh, all of time we are using free and open source software based applications. These big critical infrastructures are now powered by FOSS. In fact, even Supreme Court of India, high courts, and most of the lower courts in the country rely on free and open source software to do their case management at the moment. So as we can see, free and open source software has become a very crucial part of our digital lives, and we rely a lot on it without being much aware of it. There is also a need to understand how we can more contribute on free and open source software as a country so that we have much more ownership and control on how we are defining the open source journey for the country. Uh, our methodology. So at Civic Data Lab, we try to connect data, tech, design, social science to strengthen civic engagements in the country. We primarily increase access to public information and also find new pathways to improve citizen participation. And all of our work happen using free and open source software. Most of our technology, platform, tools, all are in open source. We also diligently publish our code in open. So it became very critical for us to understand how civic bodies like us can rely on free and open source software ecosystem to grow more citizen participation in key areas in a growing economy like ours. That's where we thought it would be essential to study how the FOSS ecosystem has grown, what are the current challenges different stakeholders face at this point, and what are the opportunities for growth for everyone by coming together and having a shared roadmap for growth. We interviewed close to 51 FOSS practitioners, understanding uh, what kind of difficulties they have faced, what kind of journeys they have in terms of adopting free and open source software, and what kind of opportunities they see. We also analyzed close to 63 case studies of different free and open source softwares being used in India. We also went through close to 26 reports, which are researching on similar topics in the past. Some of them Venki already gave example of. And lastly, we requested 8 FOSS experts from the community to review our work and shape into what you are going to see now. So the first and foremost thing which we did as part of our work is to chronicle the timeline of FOSS moment. We can see there are 6 major eras of how free and open source software ecosystem has evolved. The first era, the inception of FOSS, began in 1886 with the copyright movement, with the Berne Convention, copyright being declared, and which in turn led to the rise of public domain software. Gradually, in 1978, we saw the rise of free software with the launch of free software movement by key members like Richard Stallman, defining what are the kind of freedoms users may have with their software. We also saw rise of projects like Tex, GNU, and more in this era. Gradually, we also started to see rise of community and businesses adopting free and open source software much more often. We saw Linux being coming in open, and we also started to see Linux user groups being created globally and also in India. Around 1998, we started to see big tech fighting back the free and open source software movement a bit. We started to see Microsoft's paper on Halafine documents being leaked. We started to see a couple of other battles related to open standards. Finally, all of that came to an end with International Organization of Standardization, ISO, voting in favor of OOXML, which is an open file format for everyone to collaborate and work. Around 1999, we also started to witness global proliferation with the formation of Open Source Initiative and a couple of big tech agencies like Google adopting free and open source software. At the same time, we also saw communities getting much more formalized, like Mozilla Foundation, to support much more digital rights and internet freedom using open source. Around 2001, we started to witness penetration of free and open source software in India. We saw FOSS.in, which used to be annual event for people to come together and discuss free and open source software ecosystem in India. We started to witness things like FOSS Linux, which is Bharat open source operating system, a Linux version developed in India. And we also started to witness a couple of other initiatives like setting up of International Center for Free and Open Source Software in Kerala and Supreme Court ordering digital coach to move towards Ubuntu. Lately, in last couple of years, we have been witnessing organizations like Chatfoot, Zerodha, ERP Next, and Hasura. A couple of businesses adopting free and open source software as core to their work and scaling up their business operations, harnessing free and open source software, just bringing it to a very exciting times of what open source can do for all of us. This has given us opportunity to understand what are the kind of major FOSS-led growth opportunities for us in India. Number one, being the technology growth. We see a good opportunity for India to become a global leader in emerging technology areas like artificial intelligence, machine learning, big data, and so on. Because all this infrastructure of these emerging tech are based on free and open source software. We have seen more and more volunteers coming together globally to contribute and create building blocks of new age technology. So India can play a wider role of harnessing our software engineers towards a similar mission. Second major opportunity we witness is economic growth. We have been seeing how different countries have been using free and open source software to improve digital services for the most remote areas for the first time users by creating technology in their own local language for their own local context. So we can boost financial inclusion in India as well with the use of free and open source software by customizing our digital services for our beneficiaries as per their needs. Lastly, we have an opportunity to improve our talent growth by creating a common based knowledge pool and by creating opportunities for people to collaborate, contribute their experiences, their learnings, and their cultural aspects of how free and open source software can grow together. We are seeing early examples of it with the language community, where native language speakers, translators, software coders have come together to create translation modules in open source for several popular software systems at the moment. To achieve all of these growth opportunities, we have to study where our major stakeholders are. We see there are four major stakeholders in the FOSS ecosystem in India playing a vital role at the point. Number one is our FOSS communities. We see examples like Mozilla representatives, which are part of thousands of colleges and institutions trying to promote free and open source software and literacy across India. We also see educational institutes like IIT Bombay and Bangalore having FOSS cells, which enable more FOSS research in the academia. We are also witnessing businesses like Hasura coming together and raising close to $35 million funding to expand their business operations using free and open source software. And lastly, we are seeing government initiatives like Atal Innovation Mission, Kerala government, Assam government, using free and open source software to expand digital beneficiaries and serve much more robust software infrastructure. Let's look into how some of these stakeholders are placed, what are the challenges they faced, and what are the kind of recommendations we suggest them based on our research. So first, look into FOSS and communities. The major problem with the communities at this point is the initial barrier just to uh, be able to contribute, to collaborate in existing software communities. We have heard from different representatives that first-time contributors don't feel comfortable because of no clear onboarding process and no mentorship opportunities. Some of it is being solved with tailored program known as Google Summer of Code, where a lot of young engineering students and students from other streams are collaborating and working on popular open source software. We also see that most of the FOSS community is mostly cis male dominant at this point. There is not enough diversity and inclusivity, which ensures slightly cumbersome cultural nuances on how we create software in India. Thus, there's a need to increase representation and inclusion in some of the software development spaces. And one such effort which we came across is outreaching, where they mentor women and people from other marginalized background to join popular software programming teams, work with them for a couple of months, get comfortable, and start contributing much more. There's also need to sustain contributions in the community by having more community mobilizers and they thinking of how community succession plans could be developed and how that could be nurtured in a way that communities can grow beyond their leaders. And when all of this is done, there's an opportunity for us to connect globally with other communities contribute much more often and invest more on research and collaborations. We are seeing early example of this with Julia Computing, where one of the co-founders of Julia, Viraj Shah, who is based out of India, alongside other contributors in India, have been contributing actively to build a robust language system, which is now being downloaded at 13 million times and has been used by US federal agency to control air traffic. So there are huge opportunities like these for software code written at home to go and collaborate with other global initiatives. Next up is FOSS and academic institutions. There are several challenges which we see with FOSS and academic institutions as well. The first ever understanding of software began from our primary schools. And most of the time, we ended up learning software which are of proprietary software dominance. Uh, just because the curriculum used to mention things like Microsoft Excel, PowerPoint presentation, and so on, instead of the open source alternatives, which is restrictive because not every school, not every individual, not every family can buy those costly licenses to learn how to work and code. That's where there is a need for a slightly more agnostic FOSS-led curriculum, where they are not vendor specific and give more opportunities for students, teachers, researchers to explore how free and open source software can work. And the benefits of that are people can learn in their own languages and can customize the software, play with it, break it, and work with it at an early age. Gradually, this can also help build more FOSS education. And we are seeing examples of this with FOSS digital literacy programs created by uh, IT for Change Karnataka and institutes like IIT Bombay, where they are trying to customize digital literacy programs for the need of the people. Currently, IT for Change digital literacy program is running in 34,000 colleges and has a wider impact. We also see there is a bit of a poor contribution and retention tendency in some of our academic institutions, especially towards the FOSS communities. That's where there is a need to incentivize more research and innovation. One such example is Knowledge Lab, which encourages how free and open source software can be used in things like STEM. Also, to increase collaboration, there is an opportunity for us to create something known as open education infrastructure, where all the building blocks of your education and learning are made open source and structured and tailored together so that anyone can use and contribute and work with it much more faster in a much more easier way. And, and that could be contextualized to different geographies and could be contextualized to different areas. One such beautiful example we are seeing is with Kerala, where more than 5,000 schools and colleges are using KITE, which is Kerala Infrastructure for Technology Education, an open source initiative to use free and open source software for learning. So there's a huge opportunity for our young students and academicians to drive how free and open source software can shape in the country and contribute much more to shape the technological growth. Third up, one key stakeholder is our businesses. Businesses also have limited FOSS understanding, especially startups, MSMEs, and young businesses who have just started to explore how technology and especially free and open source software can be used in their workflows. That's where there is a need to have more FOSS workshops and training programs so that more businesses feel confident in making right technological choices at a young stage. We're seeing some of this happening in Africa, where Free Software Foundation Africa has been enabling young startups to choose FOSS options at a very early stage through their incubation program. We also see that there is a lack of understanding of what kind of free and open source software license can be used, what kind of existing code could be borrowed in the business piece, and how business models could be defined. This gap could be filled by giving right amount of legal and policy support, and an effort in this direction is by Software Freedom Law Center, where they are helping different startups, MNCs, and businesses in India to understand how free and open source software could be better used and give them right legal and policy uh, understanding and benefits. Uh, at the same time, once businesses have a decent understanding of what FOSS can do, they can start enabling their staff to do sustained contributions to popular FOSS initiatives and projects and work to sponsor more community initiatives. Example of this we are seeing with PyCon, which is a yearly conference on popular programming language Python, which seeks a lot of business opportunities for people to sponsor and also an opportunity for people to hire new talent in their organization. Lastly, with all of this, we can bring a stronger community connect and encourage businesses to collaborate much more with FOSS academia and communities. We are seeing an early example of this with FOSS United Foundation, which is recently formed, where different businesses can work together and also collaborate with community to research on free and open source software. Lastly, a very important crucial player with this is governments. Most of the time, we see that government staff have limited for staff capacity to work on different initiatives. That's where we recommend of hosting FOSS fellowships and training modules for more government staff to get comfortable in choosing what kind of free and open source software alternatives they can work with in defining some of the Digital India initiatives. We are seeing trainings by Northeast Center of National Rural Department happening on a regular basis to enable more government staff to use free and open source software at the moment. So similar initiatives can be scaled to other parts of the country. Uh, we also see that there is a lot of dependence on commercial software. Although India has an open source policy on e-governments initiative, we still see that there is lack of mandate in terms of IT procurement. Kerala Legislative Assembly, for example, has now mandated that all their IT procurements need to have free and open source software at the time of delivery. And we are also seeing low cost repositories at this point from our government initiatives, which hinders in a difficult governance model of software and also give less opportunities for citizens to collaborate, which in turn leaves some privacy gaps, security gaps, and trust issues with the software. All of it could be curbed by publishing more development plans in open, creating a shared community plan of growing the digital infrastructure, publishing government code much more in open in a proactive manner. This can in turn give shape to new governance models where a government can collaborate much more with the community, have a shared cost of ownership of our software, have much more trust-based computing. And with all of this, we can increase our reach of digital services and help co-create more digital public goods, digital infrastructures for key sectors like water, sanitation, health, and so on. And this could be reused in different geographies and could be contextualized to different cultures and languages. So immense opportunities for government to collaborate with the community, businesses, and academia on shaping digital public goods for the future. And we have seen some of it already happening with the recent pandemic. We have seen that different stakeholders coming together and publishing their code in open and quickly collaborating with each other to shape digital initiatives. We have examples like COVID-19 India, where a lot of volunteers have worked together to publish their code in open, enabling case tracking and disease spread much faster. We have seen IIC Bangalore, where they have created a city-based pandemic simulator, letting people observe how disease spread has been. We have also seen businesses publishing their code in open. For example, IBM, where they have published their functional genomics platform, letting researchers analyze the virus strands alongside the novel drugs which are being created at the moment, all of it using open source, reducing their computing power. And also, we are seeing initiatives like one created by Kerala government, which is known as Corona Safe Network, enabling more citizens to have better literacy in these difficult times. They are publishing their code in open and have been creating COVID literacy modules in more than 7 Indian languages. Even their control center is being run on free and open source software, the code of which they have published on GitHub. So there are immense opportunities for people to collaborate, contribute, and quickly create solutions which can not just respond in a crisis situations like this, but also come together much more in future to shape something which we are calling as a national FOSS alliance. That's what we see could be the future of free and open source software in India. In a national FOSS alliance, all stakeholders can come together and play a crucial role in shaping the economic, socio-economic, and development growth for the country. We see that communities can help build capacity, activate more leadership, bring more diversity. We see academic institutions foster more research and make our talent much more ready for the FOSS ecosystem. We see businesses can help incubate more FOSS projects and communities and also create more marketplace for some of the FOSS innovations in the country. And we see governments can play a major role by creating more FOSS-led initiatives, creating technology stacks and infrastructure which could be scalable and could work in multiple sectors, and finally localize some of the software code in Indian language ecosystem, enabling more first-time internet users to learn and work in their own languages and in their own local context. With the National FOSS Alliance, we can look for a multiplier effect of how FOSS can take us and help us become a digital economy leader. So with that thought, I would like to quickly thank my team members at Civic Data Lab, even at Omidyar Network, and some of the individuals who have helped us work in this report. And with that, I'm going to let you download the report from this. That's the QR code state. And can you hear me now? Sorry, I think there was some sort of an internet hiccup. Uh, with that, I would hand it over to Varad Pande, who is going to moderate today's panel on FOSS and governments. Varad Pande is a partner at Omidyar Network, and he would be introducing our panels for FOSS and governments today.
Thank you, Gaurav. Just to confirm, Gaurav, you can hear me?
Yes, Varad, we can hear you.
Okay, great. No, thank you, Gaurav and Venki, for kicking off what promises to be a fascinating week of discussions on various aspects of free and open source software. I am Varad Pande, a partner at Omidyar Network India. We are an investment firm focused on social impact. We are very excited to have supported this work, as our purpose as an organization is to help bold entrepreneurs create a meaningful life for every Indian. We call our investment philosophy tech for good, har zindagi behtar. And for us, this has two aspects. The first aspect is good tech. Like many of you, we believe in the power of tech to drive massive inclusion, and hence we support many organizations, both in for-profit and non-for-profit sectors, who are working on leveraging tech. But we also recognize the limitations of and the potential harms of technology, and therefore we support a number of organizations working on the theme of responsible tech. So, this report is very, very timely. As you all know, with the mobile phone becoming a reality in the hands of most Indians, data access becoming ubiquitous, and in 2020, the pandemic teaching us all many lessons, including the acceleration in the pace of digitization, a discussion on the potential of FOSS could not be more timely. So first up, let me congratulate Gaurav and the entire CDL team and advisors for putting together such a comprehensive, meaningful and timely report. A first of its kind report, as Venki said, and hopefully will open the door for an important chapter in India's FOSS evolution. And what better way to discuss the road forward than to start with a panel on the role of government. We have a fabulous set of panelists today who are, I would say, in the thick of the action. We have Mr. Abhishek Singh, who is the CEO of MyGov and the head of the National E-Governance Division at the Ministry of Electronics and IT. Welcome, Mr. Singh. He is an officer of the Indian Administration Service and an alumnus of IIT Kanpur and the Harvard Kennedy School, where he was a Mason Fellow. We have Mr. Satish Babu. Mr. Babu is the co-founder and president of INAP, Kerala-based technology company. He has been the founding director of ICFOSS, the International Center for Free and Open Source Software, which is an autonomous institution of the government of Kerala. He's a very well-known proponent of the FOSS movement and has played a key role in Kerala's efforts to promote the adoption of FOSS. We have Mr. Viraj Tyagi, who is the CEO of the eGovernments Foundation, an organization that has built a very comprehensive and impressive open source technology platform for urban governance, which is currently being scaled across 400 plus cities. I lose the count, Viraj, on that, in partnership with various states and the central government. Viraj's background is as an entrepreneur. He's built many large businesses, an alumnus of IIM Bangalore and IIT BHU. We also were supposed to have Ms. Anna Roy, Senior Advisor, NITI Aayog. I think she was having some connectivity troubles, but hopefully she can join us at some point in the conversation. So thank you everyone for joining. And I just wanted to start with a basic question firstly for all the panelists and request a brief response before we dive into more specifics. FOSS and free and open source software means really different things to different people. What does FOSS mean to you and how important do you think it is? Maybe we can start with you, Mr. Singh.
Yeah. See, FOSS I must first compliment the entire team for organizing this, and the report that was just published shows the impact of FOSS and the kind of potential that we have in the field of FOSS and what it can, in what ways it can make adoption of e-governance projects and all easier. But at the same time, I'd like to mention that it's not that FOSS is something that that's new. It has been around for a long time, and there are a lot of government, and within, if I talk it from the perspective of the government has also been adopting a lot of FOSS projects. So when we look at FOSS, there are one, of course, it's called free and open source, right? So free means normally in the usual sense, people would think that you don't pay for it, you don't buy licenses for using it, and you kind of use it without any cost, which actually is not the right way to look into it. Free should mean that it is freely available. It is available for anyone and everyone to use, but you will have to build in necessary systems for using it, supporting it, and trying to leverage it. So very often the first thing comes in, like whenever people try to adopt FOSS, they will say कि फिर इसमें पैसा क्यों लग रहा है? Why are we paying for it, for a support or whatever? So that one basic confusion that happens, and then people say that if I have to pay for it, then why I am taking FOSS? So why do not take proprietary? So when we talk about FOSS, we should, the change that we need to do in our communications about FOSS is that free is not free of cost. And it's not that FOSS is better than proprietary because it's free of cost. FOSS is better than proprietary because it's an effort, it's a product which has been developed by collaborative effort of multiple players, and whenever people join together to build something, it's definitely better than a few minds working on it, or people getting stuck by the walls in which proprietary software works. So that is the basic USP that FOSS should target. And when we talk about open source, then very often, again, other confusion very often I find in many of the stakeholders within the government is that open source means everything is open and anybody can access it, anybody can come and change your code and can like override systems and kind of it's a security threat. Again, there also the communications that we need to say is that open source means it's open for collaborators to work in, to push, to suggest you changes, but whether you accept something or not, it's up to you. It's up to you. Should have the capability of assess the various code changes. It's like you having a code of developers, and they're giving you, if you have 5 developers, 5 of them give you different solutions. Which one you decide. But when you go to the open source domain, then you have the entire community of developers available who are going to collectively use their wisdom and their intellect and their expertise to contribute something to the product and ensure that it's whatever they are working on becomes better. But what you take, which push request you accept, and what you actually build into your final product, it still remains in your control. So whenever you are going to, so these are the 2 aspects which very often when we talk to departments who are a bit not very warm to adopting FOSS, that we try to say, number 1, don't take it that it is something which is free. Don't think that anything which is open source is less secure, and don't think that like anybody can play around with your systems. And don't use FOSS only for saving cost or only for thinking it as a substandard product. Take it as something which is better than proprietary, wherein you may need some support, but have the internal expertise in order to leverage that. And luckily, this communication has become easier because there are many government projects today which are on FOSS, whether it's the Aadhaar or the GSTN, which you spoke about, or the DigiLocker project, or the Umang project, or the PFMS, e-office, the Center of Geoinformatics platform that we are building, all are in an open source.
Yeah.
So it's not that something not acceptable, but yes, that's what we need to communicate about FOSS.
Yeah. No, I think you make a fabulous point, Mr. Singh, that, is it that FOSS has a bit of a branding problem? The same words that appeal to a large number of people when we say free and open also end up confusing some people or misinterpreting what it actually means and what it actually offers. And is this sort of, it's leading to its own problem. So I would love to probe that a little bit with you, but coming to Mr. Babu, you are an exemplar of adoption of FOSS, and especially Kerala. Team was how has Kerala done it? How these are the issues that Mr. Singh mentioned, and the challenges with open source software are endemic. What has been the Kerala story? How has it become an exemplar in the adoption of free and open software?
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and first of all, congratulations to the team behind the report, and also for this opportunity. I think the first question of what is really FOSS, at least when you look at from the perspectives of multiple stakeholders, the activist perspective is very distinct from the e-governance perspective, which is very distinct from the professional FOSS, which means the industry, and so. I was just hearing the point being made that FOSS is nothing new. It has been there. Now, I come from a background when FOSS is actually absolutely fringe. Nobody knew about it. Nobody kind of had heard about it. I'm speaking about the mid-90s and up until the 2000s. Now, in Kerala, we are fortunate to have a kind of a community, generally, the civil society itself, that looks for alternatives, which is not very enamored by the mainstream big tech, offerings of technology. And in the late 1990s, there's a small group working with the international community behind free software, that is Richard Stallman and others. And in 2001 and 2002, we did two big conferences. One was called Freedom First, which was introducing this whole concept of free software. At that point, we did not call it free and open source. We called it free software because there's a very political kind of angle to that at that point. When free software was introduced to India, and 2002, we had the flagship international conference of the tech user group. I don't know if people are aware of tech and LeTech, which is a very, very vibrant industry itself in itself. So the actual outcome of these two conferences was that we sensitized the civil society, the media, and the government. It was a bottom-up approach. It was not a top-down. We were nobody. I mean, some of us who were from the NGO kind of background, we had no kind of mandate to kind of convince the government otherwise. So this is the bottom-up effort. It's a kind of ecosystem approach where the bottom began to be convinced about it first. The media, the civil society, the schools, the teachers, and it worked upwards from there. And seeing this, the government was also kind of convinced that this is something that we should explore. And in the 2001 IT policy of the state government, there was a mention of support, explicit support to free and open source software. By then, we had switched to free and open source. And I will not go in great detail. From that point, there was a lot of independent projects coming up, including the very important IT school, which was very important because the teachers themselves became programmers. That is only possible because of the fact that source code was available. So we should recognize the fact that software comes in two incompatible forms: the source code and the executable code. The source code humans can understand, computers cannot understand. The executable code, the computers can understand, we cannot understand. If you want to modify executable code, we cannot unless we have the source code. The access to source code is extremely important. And the teachers of Kerala proved that if you have access to source code, they could themselves become programmers, although nobody kind of trained them in that. In that sense, it was kind of revolutionary because from bottom up, it worked upwards. And I'll stop here. I don't want to take more. But this is in very brief the experience of Kerala.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for sharing that. And I think that plug for the report. I think the report does a good job of sort of tracking that history a little bit in some more detail with lots of links, etc. as well. And just for the interest of the panelists, I think on the YouTube stream link, there's a good active discussion happening on how governments can incentivize FOSS communities. So Mr. Singh, I'll come back to you on that. But I wanted to bring in Viraj. Viraj, eGovernments Foundation has really shown the potential of an open source platform to be deployed at scale in the country and adopted by governments at such scale. I mean, the kind of growth you all have seen in the last few years is quite mind-boggling. So whereas there are not that many examples like eGov, which have done the same. So very curious to hear from you on what do you think has been the secret sauce? Why has your platform scaled while other open source solutions probably haven't?
So first of all, thank you for having me here. It's fascinating to hear the report and what Abhishek ji said and Satish ji said earlier. And congratulations, CivicDataLab, for putting this together. First of all, there's no secret sauce. It's all open source. I think all our knowledge is also open source. I think we are quite happy to, So I think first, when we started thinking about open source, I think the first question was, why does India need it? And I think when you look at India, I think it's not a subcontinent, it's a continent. The diversity, complexity, and the variance that we have, it is to assume that one central platform or one central software or one private software can solve it. I think it's unimaginable. You cannot solve it because the problems have a higher velocity than the solutions in some cases. And that kind of brings you to the point of saying, how do you get people who are deep in the context? Somebody who's actually in Asansol has a much better idea of what are the problems of Asansol than somebody sitting in either Guwahati or Delhi or Bangalore. So I think for us, having open source as a construct, free and open source as a construct, was basically trying to distribute that ability to solve and get the ecosystem to participate, whether it's what we call Samaj, Sarkar, and Bazaar, right? And the second thing is, you should also, I mean, when you look at urban, India has on an average, 2.3 municipal employees per 10,000 citizens. Southeast Asia has about 7. Cities like London and New York has 15. So I think there is a capacity constraints which I think open source, as a concept has a ability to unlock, because a lot of people can participate and contribute. So I think once we kind of were clear on the value that it can create for the stakeholders, I guess the journey has been, it's like there's no secret sauce. We kind of made a bunch of mistakes, we open sourced our code in 2014 and expecting that there'll be demand rushing through. And 3 years we waited, nothing happened. So I think one of the learnings we've had is what Abhishek ji said earlier was very important. People are looking for software to solve their problems and de-risk them. When you work with government, risk is a very important construct, right? I think a lot of us come from private sectors where we are actually used to taking risk. But I think de-risking in terms of the outcomes, the risk that you perceive around maintainability, the risk you perceive around security are real. So I think first thing we should actually recognize is that it should be what we call faster, better, cheaper, right? To actually stand in front of, free is just in our mind when we started changing how we talk to the ecosystem, actually saying it's open. It's open for innovation. It's open for participation. It's open for, co-creation. So that's one. Second is you have to really get your hands dirty as a foundation. So we kept saying, come market, play with us, come state, play with us. But ultimately we rolled up our sleeves and said they will actually make it work in one state. Actually prove to ourselves and prove it to the ecosystem, it is actually faster, better, and cheaper. So when we did Punjab, and in 90 days we had 100 ULBs up and running of a single instance. That was a moment when, the kind of adoption was not our problem then. Our problem was really, meeting the demand, because then we don't have to go and sell it. Third thing I'll just, say is it should be about building open, and MeitY has written a paper on national open digital ecosystem. I know Omidyar has done a bunch of work on open digital ecosystem. It has to be designed for an ecosystem from day one. It has to be designed keeping in mind that there are constraints. There would be marketplace who would be interested in that. So making the market play on top of your digital infra or open source, this thing is extremely important. So I think those are 2 or 3 things I thought I'll briefly mention.
No, I think that's great. I think the point that, it's not about offering an approach or it is about helping solve problems, and helping de-risk is what you need to do, because that's where you can meet the person at, where the issue is. Now, Mr. Singh, I wanted to come to you to probe this a little bit more, right? And, MeitY has been a flag bearer of the open source movement. There's a FOSS policy, there's a implementation guidelines. But as you were saying earlier as well, adoption by government has been patchy. And you mentioned a few of the reasons around misconceptions around it. What is the, what would change that, right? Do you feel that there is a allure of proprietary software in some way, which is, seems more efficient, ready to deploy, easy to contract, etc., etc.? Are there other issues, and how does one address those in your view?
See, while I said that there are some misconceptions about FOSS in some stakeholders, but this doesn't mean that I would not agree with the statement that adoption of FOSS in government is patchy. In fact, if you look at most of the major IT projects, as I mentioned, if you look at the last few years, the biggest project that we have any government, or maybe not only India but across the world, any government have done is the biometrics Aadhaar project that we did. It was entirely, but for the deduplication software, almost the entire stack is on an open source platform. The way they have MySQL, they have MongoDB, they have Hive, they have Hadoop stack, Mule, Rabbit. So all key elements have been used in some form or the other to build the Aadhaar platform. If you look at the GSTN, it's entirely built on the open source platform. If you look at the DigiLocker, the Umang, the projects which are part of my Digital India offerings, they are all on open source platform. The government e-marketplace, it has been built on an open source platform. Then the e-office, the ANCOG, the geoinformatics platform that we are building, it's all on open source. States are adopting open source. So I will not say it's patchy, There are misconceptions. We need to explain to the stakeholders with regard to doing that. And states like Kerala, as Mr. Satish Babu has mentioned, have been the pioneers in adopting to open source, or Tamil Nadu or Assam. When the e-district project was launched in Assam, they did adopt open source. So it has been in the major government departments being adopted. It has been adopted in various NIC projects. It's been adopted in various state governments. And if a state like Assam and Kerala as diverse can adopt, then it can be done everywhere. With regard to allure of proprietary software, yes, every proprietary software company has a business development unit. They keep on trying their own bit to sell their products. But it's up to us, and especially MeitY, which we published our open source policy long back, and we have a policy stated on open source and open standards and open APIs. So based on that, all major projects are being done. And I will mention that the CoWIN platform that is being built up for the vaccination module that will begin on 16, that will be also an open source platform. So yeah, government has been adopting it, and wherever these issues are there with regard to lack of understanding or some hesitancy, that's where our role comes in. We go there, we talk to them, explain to them, we remove the doubt, and do the advocacy, do the capacity building, ensure that people with the necessary skill sets are there who understand how it works, and make it as open as possible. If you look at the other major project about which there was a lot of noise, was the Aayog Setu app. There also, it was ultimately the code has been published in the open domain. It's not entirely open source as it should be, because open source would allow people to put in their requests, and it should be able to be adopted into the system. But right now, NIC was a bit reluctant because there was a threat, and there was some inputs with regard to that. People will replicate the app, and there will cause a lot of confusion if similar functionality apps are built in by using the stack that has been published. So the code was published in open domain, but ideally open source should mean a collaborative form of development, getting developers working together in close coordination and building a better product. So that is what has been the policy. So yeah, what else did you say? And
no, I think
yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, so ultimately, I should say that in government or anywhere else, your requirement should be like the policy of the government of India is to FOSS first, open source first. If there is something which is non-critical, which is something which can be done by existing modules which are available on GitHub or OpenForge, like OpenForge is a repository that we built, Government of India has built, on which all our code development takes place, and it has been very handy during the pandemic. Like the entire development happens by people working at remote locations, and all that happens. So open source has been a part of government's ecosystem, and the default mode of developing a product is open source. If you don't do open source, you have to justify why are you going for a proprietary software, and that's where it comes in. Like suppose somebody wants to use a proprietary database, they have to justify why is going for that and why not using something which is available on the FOSS platform. So that is what I would like to say on this.
Okay, got it. So, just moving on to the one of the important points that this report makes is that while India is a very active consumer of free and open source software, it is not a very active contributor So I wanted to get firstly, Mr. Babu, from your lens, since you've seen this, the history of this, what is the reason that we are not, given the kind of homegrown engineering talent we have and innovators we have and so on, why are we not really at the forefront of contributing to this movement, and what can the government do in terms of addressing that?
Thanks for the question. I think it's a highly relevant question. Before I come to that, I'd like to respond to some of the points made earlier. I think first of all, the government of India has done reasonably well. We should recognize that, and that's a very positive thing that we should recognize compared to many other governments in other parts of the world. This is not to say that everything has been achieved. There are still many things to be done, but we should recognize the fact that government of India has tried its best under many constraints to kind of adopt open source in a kind of massive manner. But the real problem here is, if you look at other countries, especially Europe, you find that there are certain strategic positions that they've taken that should guide how we should source software. First of all, future is all digital. The entire future is going to be digital. So we're looking at 30, 40, 50 years from now, we're going to the data that we store today is going to have to be accessible at that point also. There are multiple issues coming up when you look at that kind of a horizon. It is not for today or for tomorrow. It is a very, very distant long-term kind of a plan. Secondly, if you have publicly funded software, public money, any software that is built on public money, then it follows that it should be open source. That's what many of the governments in Europe have recognized. This is very similar to publicly funded research of scholarly publishing should be open access. That has been now accepted, and even the big players like Elsevier have kind of changed tax. Then about open data and the general movement from open source to digital public goods. The 2020 UN Secretary General's report on digital cooperation has flagged digital public goods as the way to go. This is a bunch of things that includes not just software but also standards and even open data and many other things. So looking at all this, I think the positions that we have to take as a government, as civil society, as the industry are pretty much clear. Now, to come back to the question of why haven't we contributed so well to the global, open source repositories. Now, the situation 10 years back was somewhat much worse, I would say. There were a few flagship projects which did very well, but by and large, we were consumers more than producers. But I think it is now changing, and we are now getting plugged into several of the global networks or communities of open source production or peer production. And although it is not coming to India, Indians are actually contributing to this global project, which is what we should be doing. Although having local solutions for local problems would be ideal on a kind of hyper-local post-COVID mode, and we will have to kind of encourage in some way the local communities to produce their own software. So that is the kind of social issue that we have to consider, especially the government, but also people like us in this call here today. So I'll stop here.
Yeah, I think those are great ideas, and I wanted to sort of also pose the same question to Mr. Singh a little bit, which is that, and this is one of the questions which has come in the chat right now from the audience, is that typically government is open to consumption of open source, but they are hesitant on contributing to open source. How do you think we can get government to increase its contribution in this space?
What the endeavor has been that to ensure that all the code that has been developed, all the IP that the government has with regard to working on various projects, whether it's a departmental thing, and is uploaded on the Open Forge. So a lot of codes, lot of modules is already available. But yes, very often the teams which are implementing a project, their mandate very often is limited to delivering a particular service for which an application is being developed. But if you look at the present regime, like if you look at the open APIs, so I am told almost 71,000 APIs have been published on the Open API portal. And then if you look at the government app store, the eGov app store, 61 applications have been published there. The codes, more and more codes are being published on the Open Forge for people to use and access. So while the measures have been taken, but yes, it can be much more. Like NIC has a lot of applications that is used for everyone, which is not presently available on a open to use, free to use platform. So one is working with them, trying to tell them what is the value of creating a public good. Like how do you ensure that whatever is developed and whatever work is there, you do that, get the benefit of the best of the developers on the open source community, and then get benefit from there, but at the same time contribute also. So whatever you have can be used for anyone and everyone. Like the Aadhaar has been a classic example. The verification system that is there, it's available as a building block for anyone to use it and integrate it into their applications for doing authentications. So similarly, any service which is there, which can be used by anyone to build up an application on that will help. The open data policy of the government of India, especially the data.gov.in portal, also is something that has a lot of data sets still available. But in many ways, very many researchers and many developers tell me that it can be better. Like the way the data is presented, the formats in which it is presented, the way it is accessible, it can be better, because the government is the largest, maybe the producer of data of any kind, and whatever data is can be which does not relate to a non-personal data. If this kind of data is made available on a open easy to share platform, then there will be developers who will build apps and who will build value-added services which will ultimately help the cause of the government and the citizens both. So that is where we need to invest more time and energy, explain the value that is there, and once you're using it, also sharing that. So it requires some advocacy, it requires some capacity building, it requires some sharing of best practices, sharing of examples where this has happened and in what ways it has contributed to developing better products. So I think that is what needs to be done to ensure that government contributes more to the open source community.
Yeah. No, I think those are great ideas. And I think the combination of people, communities and the government can really work together on this, right? I think to allow for more cross-fertilization. And there are a number of ideas here, I think, in the report as well. Things like, could there be more FOSS fellows in government, for example, right? Who end up working closely with, say, the NIC team, et cetera, too. And so, Viraj, on that question, I wanted to come to you because, you work with a lot of young people who are very passionate about this subject and are also now through eGovernments Foundation working with government on some of these, builds, etc. So what can be done from from where you sit and where others sit outside government to scale, adoption of FOSS and actually adoption and contribution? I think both those aspects.
Yeah. No, I think some very good points both Satish and Abhishek have made. I think when you look at adoption, I think one of the things is what we've realized is there is a overarching policy on FOSS that government has issued. I think you also need blueprints and toolkits for people to in government to make it usable. I think, for example, National Digital Health Blueprint, NDHM. I think that's a good way to translate the philosophy of open source into what are building blocks, what are standards, how do you evaluate whether interoperability is there or not. Similarly, NUIS, which urban National Urban Innovation Stack. So I think it is very important that once the guidelines are issued, in their own context, the various kind of domains within government actually create their own digital blueprints, which essentially do the job of evangelizing. This is a way. This is a philosophy. I think at the core of it, building public digital good is a philosophy. It's a very different philosophy where you share value rather than distribute and hoard value, and then give some practical tools like digital blueprints, frameworks, evaluation criteria, so that people can actually deploy it. Because otherwise, you will just look at the old RFP and say, let's do this, and that's where I think a lot of the kind of market muscle comes to play. I think other thing is the open source community also has a responsibility to actually evangelize and actually sell. I mean, I'll use the word. I think it's important because ultimately, decision makers have limited time. So I think you need to understand decision makers and see how you address what they're looking from a value perspective. How do you address their concerns on risk and all those things? And how do you create a greater coalition around you, which is basically rather than you talking about it, if a market player talks about it, I can actually build this for you using this platform. For example, now in Tamil Nadu, one of the company actually use your platform to bid for a rural governance program, and they've actually got a statewide mandate. So that's when the ecosystem starts coming into play. Now we're talking to community players like Reap Benefit, saying how can you use this to amplify your impact. So I think unless you create that kind of what I call the kind of cascading effect of or domino effect of various ecosystem actors coming together, and government is about scale. This is what government's responsibility is to the citizen: deliver services at scale, deliver benefits at scale. So I think whatever you do, it needs to scale, whether it's enablement, whether it's documentation and everything. So that's on the kind of adoption side. Both from a government point of view and the open source community point of view. I think second is from a contribution point of view. I would say we still have some distance to go in terms of really building communities, really building exciting people to volunteer and come and build stuff. We saw during the during the pandemic, using that digit infra, we built a national ePass platform. MeitY was a partner with us. We saw amazing participation from young kids who actually build various components in various parts of India, saying, I'll build this data migration toolkit. I'll build this front end. And that's the kind of, we need to do more, I would say, as a open source community, to have thematics, rather than saying it's open source, but saying, what do you care about? I care about, access. I care about health. I care about governance. I think that's another thing we need to really work hand in hand with government to actually create some thematics for people to get excited and find ways for them to contribute.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think it sort of emphasizes the point you were making earlier, that you have to help solve real problems at scale if you want to drive adoption. And I think, one reflection, somebody who's not very deeply embedded in this community, but observes it from a distance, is that I think, people in the community also, FOSS community also tend to be quite inward looking at times, right? And as you said, there is that bridge you have to also create to be out there, to amplify, to build the right coalition, to reach the right stakeholders, to understand the problem statement, work together to then solve it, as opposed to doing it in your own system or silo kind of thing. So I think that would be. I'm curious to know. I think we'll be out of time shortly, but I was curious to know your views on the last suggestion which Gaurav made, which is, if you will, the sort of flagship idea coming out of the report, which is a national FOSS alliance, which is essentially a sort of a platform that brings together, key people who are working in the domain between government, community, educators, businesses, etc., and create something which is, large at scale, meaningful for the country. Curious to know what you guys think about that. Maybe I'll start with you, Mr. Babu.
Thank you for the question. I think kind of multi-stakeholder organization, in order to drive free and open source software forward, is a good idea. I can foresee several challenges in the process, but I think it is interesting, and we should continue to discuss over it and see what are the alternate models possible. India is very large geographically; it's very diverse. How inclusive can we be? There are many political strains within open source free software kind of groups. So we have to ensure that we have a fairly representative body with a clear mandate that takes us forward in this whole journey towards from open source to kind of building up more and more things around it, and going the digital public goods or whatever path we look at for the future. I think it's worth discussing, certainly. And I have to leave shortly, so apologies if I drop off after a while.
No, thank you. I think we'll also wrap up shortly. Viraj, what do you think about this idea and how to make? I mean, at some level, it is a idea which you're hard to disagree with, right? But how do you make it practical and take it forward? Is the thought that you might have some reflections on?
Yeah. And I think all collaborations initially are difficult. I remember in our organization when we said we'll get implementation partners was like sacrilege. How can you do that? So I think, given that the whole philosophy of open source community is co-creation and collaboration, I think we should actually pursue this idea with energy. But equally, what Satish ji was saying, we need to be very clear on the mandate, because otherwise it just becomes a repository of multiple ideas. And one of the things worth considering is that you're going to pick up a theme. Let's say we talk about contribution, right? Actually solve for that. I think people get energy behind solving for something that we all care about, right? So I think my request will be, let's keep it very sharp on the edge initially, right? To actually get the energy going of the ecosystem. And then we can expand the mandate, because sometimes what happens, you create a very large mandate.
Yeah.
It just becomes vectors which are just going in various directions, and net kind of impact is zero. So I think that will be one suggestion I have.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I don't know if Mr. you still there? I don't see your face, but I can see your audio thing there.
We can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry, your audio is not very clear. Yeah, might have. Yeah.
No, we can't hear you.
Yeah, I think your audio isn't very clear, so we can't hear you. But I think this has been a fascinating discussion. So I think we're almost out of time. So just to say thank you to all of you, Mr. Singh, Mr. Babu, Mr. Tyagi, for joining us and engaging with such interest and passion. I think if these ideas have to go forward, I think the three of you will have a very important role to play. So don't be surprised if people reach out to you to help in this. And I wanted to take the opportunity again to also thank the CDL team and Venki and others for putting this together. And for the audience, just wanted to mention this is just a start. We have a very exciting week ahead. Tomorrow, there's a discussion on FOSS in education at 5 p.m. On Thursday, there's a discussion on FOSS and businesses at 5 p.m. And on Friday, FOSS and communities at 6 p.m. And on the CDL website and social media handles, you'll get all the registration details. But these are all pieces of the report that we're trying to unpack in different sessions. Really appreciate all of you engaging and participating and hoping that the India FOSS Week is the start of an important movement for India's future. So with those words, thank you everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And people in the audience, if people want to talk to us, we'd love to invite you to work with us and do some kick-ass coding on an open source platform. So please drop us a line, and we'd love to kind of hear from you.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Clear practical offer from you to great way to end the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.